off. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today for this fabulous session around unpacking SCHADS. And I'm glad it's not me having to provide the content, so it's you ladies. So I'm as interested as everyone else for the session. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Kylie Hogan. I'm part of the industry and workforce development team at CheckUP. And if you're not aware of who CheckUP is, we're a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to improving the health and wellbeing of people and communities who need it the most and within those communities. And we do that through a range of initiatives across the health and community services sector. I guess the two most relevant probably for the group of people here today is our industry workforce advisor program, which is funded through Department of Trade, Employment and Training, and that's around supporting businesses with their workforce planning. And then the other one is NDIS Business Connect, and that's funded through the Queensland Government Disability Peak Funding Program, and that's a capacity and capability building project for new and existing sole traders and small businesses that are providing supports in Queensland for people with disability. But there's lots of information on our website, and we'll be able to send some of that information out when we send the resources for the program. So I'm not keen to take up any more of the time because you're all here to hear from the lovely ladies from Effective HR around unpacking SCHADS. So I'm going to hand back over to you, and thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Kylie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar in collaboration with CheckUP. As we know, the SCHADS Award, it can be one of the most complex modern awards, and navigating its nuances is often a challenge for many businesses, whether it's managing rosters, interpreting classifications, or staying updated with compliance changes. Keeping everything aligned can feel overwhelming. And that's exactly why today's webinar is designed to bring clarity and confidence to the key areas of the award that impact your daily operations. We're here to help you break down the complexities and ensure that you have a solid understanding to support your business in managing compliance effectively. Now, today's session is being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit the content or share it with your team after the webinar. Now, before we proceed, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all work today. I pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar. I also acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging for their ongoing contributions to our communities. Now, before we dive in, we'd also love to introduce ourselves. I'm Emma, a HR consultant at Effective HR, and I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Corinne, our lead HR consultant. Between us, we've spent many years supporting businesses just like yours, particularly in the NDIS and community services space, navigating everything from HR to safety to payroll compliance, and often the confusing world of the SCHADS Award. Now, in today's session, we'll be focusing on the key elements of the SCHADS Award that are most relevant to your day-to-day operations, including streams, classifications, and pay points, along with engagement, broken shifts, breaks, sleepovers, remote work, and work health and safety obligations. At the end of the session, we will open the floor for a Q&A, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we will address as many as possible during our interactive discussion. I'll hand it over now to Corinne, who will take us through the technical content.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to dive straight in and looking at an overview of the SCHADS Award because it can get confusing even from the start. What's really important to understand here is that the SCHADS Award actually contains 4 sectors within it. For our NDIS providers, you're most likely going to be looking at our social and community services sector or our home care sector, which now has 2 substreams being disability care and aged care to cover your organisations. We also have the family daycare scheme sector and our crisis assistance and supported housing sector. I do spend most of my days working with clients that are covered by this award, and there is a lot of confusion out there. So understanding that the home care award, it's not something separate, it's still contained within that SCHADS Award. Same as the social and community services sector. It's not a separate award. It is all still contained within the SCHADS Award. However, that stream or sector differentiation can actually have a big impact on determining entitlements for our team members. So it is really important that we get it right. So the graphic that you're seeing on the screen right now is what needs to be determined in order to be confident that you are paying each employee correctly. So while that top line of determining what sector applies to an organisation as a whole, so not at any particular employee or client or shift, but as a business, as an organisation, what is our primary purpose? What are our core service deliveries? That is how we determine our sectors. Once we have determined that and applied that to the organisation as a whole, we can then start looking at our classifications, which are contained at the back of the award in the schedules. So Schedule B for our SAC stream and E and F for our home care streams. And we are reading those classifications to determine which is most appropriate for any particular employee. So you may have a general range of classifications that you use to cover the bulk of your team members, say a support worker role. However, there's a bit more that goes into, instead of just saying, right, we're a support worker level 1 or level 2, exactly what does that look like to get those right rates of pay? So if we go back to basics and go, who should be covered by home care? Who should be covered by SACs, and what's the difference? This is something that I see a lot of people get wrong. So if you're listening to this and feeling a little bit worried, it's okay. You're not the only one, and we can work it out together. Generally speaking, and provided for under the definition section at clause 3 of the award, our home care sector is designed and defined to cover more of that core supports and daily assistance that's completed in a client's private residence. So this is focused on domestic assistance, home maintenance, and personal care duties. So the basic requirements each day. Whereas our SACS stream, so our social and community services sector, it's defined to cover more community-based capacity building, recreational activities, support coordination services, provision of SIL and STA, is generally what we would find under the SACS sector, those types of businesses. What's really interesting is this area is very nuanced. We work quite closely with the Fair Work Ombudsman Direct to be getting advice on a case-by-case basis to ensure compliance and understanding of how the award is interpreted here. What's really interesting and what I've seen with a recent client is, even though they were going into the client's home and they didn't leave the home all day, the nature of the support that they were providing was not based on that personal care, but based on that psychosocial support, which we found actually to fall outside the definition of the home care sector. So even though they rarely left the home, they were actually covered by the social and community services stream. So that's just one example of why this is so important to get it right. I often get asked if we can use both streams to cover our workforce. If we've got some people doing our home care duties, some people doing our SACS duties. My default answer is to say no. I'm not saying it's impossible, but generally speaking, an organisation as a whole is going to fit into one of those categories. It would only be if we're looking at, I guess, a more technical discipline with award coverage of whether or not we have a dual substantive character for that organisation that we might look at doing something like that. For our clerical employees, there's plenty of coverage under the social and community services sector for our organisations covered there. Our home care, it's quite nuanced and we need to look at on a case-by-case basis. Previously, there was advice from the regulator saying that admin were not covered under home care. However, that research article we often relied on has magically disappeared from the library website there. And so it is something that we really need to be looking at the direct text and analysing who's covered by what. In terms of why this stuff matters, why are we talking about it today? Why have we all gathered to go through it? That award coverage and the classification levels form the basis for employee entitlements. So our classification is going to tell us what level we're on. Our pay points is going to tell us within that level what pay point we're at. and that's governed by clause 13.3 of the SCHADS award. It also tells us how we may be eligible to progress from pay point to pay point. And we also need that final determination of whether an employee is a shift worker or a day worker to complete that piece of the puzzle. We'll look at that a little bit more detail shortly. The reason why this is important is because if it's wrong, we're going to not be compliant. And that's a big deal when we think about now looking at criminal liability for underpaying staff, as well as fines for non-compliance. So we really want to make sure that this foundation is correct. There's a significant variance in the rates of pays in the home care sector versus the SACS sector. The way certain provisions are applied, so if we're working in community services in SACS but not in disability services, we can't use broken shifts. Very simple things like that just won't apply. So this is why it's important that we get our stream and sector determination right so that we are building from a strong foundation. In terms of that classification and pay point progression, I often get asked the question of what comes first. Do I look at someone's classification, or do I look at someone's rate of pay, or agree on a rate of pay, potentially with a new employee coming on board? What I see happen a lot is we'll find a great candidate to recruit. We're going to hit it off instantly. We're going to find out what they worked at their old job, agree on a rate of pay, probably the same, if not higher, to get them to come over and work for you. And then the deal's done. We go back to the award, we check the pay guide, we find the rate closest to that, and that's their classification. A lot of people do that. Unfortunately, it's wrong, and it's back to front. What we need to do is we need to start at the classification level first. So when I talk about reading those classification schedules, I'm reading them almost as if they're a position description. So potentially comparing it to an existing position or understanding someone's roles to go, what is your roles, your qualifications, perhaps your experience, your tenure? What's the supervision structure more broadly in the organisation from which this role will report? From there, we're able to determine a classification level. Now, of course, you can offer someone higher than the rate of pay linked to that level, but that tells us the minimum that we can offer someone, and that's also what all our other entitlements can be calculated off. So we want to be clear that we know exactly what someone's classification is. I often get asked the question if we have to progress through pay points every 12 months. And again, referring to clause 13.3 here, what's really interesting is we've had a recent case law decision. So gone to the courts, tested, got some precedent to come out of that to explain what the bloody hell clause 13.3 is actually on about. And probably the key thing that came out of this is looking at the wording around every 12 months an employee is eligible. Keyword eligible, not entitled, eligible. It then goes on to tell us potential criteria that we're applying to move through pay points. In terms of the so what factor and what does that actually mean for you? Do I need to put someone's rate of pay up every year? Do I need to progress them through pay points every year? What does that look like? Firstly, our rates of pay are always going to go up on our end of financial year. So next week, we should have those updates done in payroll systems and make sure that you're across that. Secondly, pay point progressions, that's going to happen on someone's anniversary. So not necessarily the same time every year, like end of financial year. It's going to be different per employee. And my advice to you is to say, the most conservative approach is to put someone up each year, and they will stop at the ceiling of the highest pay point. They won't then move to the next pay point. However, if there are grounds and there's good reason to hold someone back, let's systemize that process. Let's make sure as on their anniversary, we're actually doing a pay point progression review. We're completing a checklist and we're communicating with the employee for transparency to say, yes, you're going up, or no, you're staying the same, and this is why. That simple system can help mitigate so much risk in this area when it comes to making sure we've got the right rate of pay for each employee. The last piece of the puzzle I mentioned in terms of working out someone's rate of pay under the SCHADS award is being confident for each employee understand if you are a day worker or a shift worker. In accordance with the award, an employee is going to be a shift worker if the employer advises them in writing that they are a shift worker. Super helpful definition. And that's what we're working with. We do know, however, that our day workers span from 6 a.m. till 8 p.m. Monday to Sunday. We do know that our afternoon shifts are going to finish essentially after 8 o'clock or before midnight, Monday to Friday. Our night shifts are going to be finishing after midnight and commencing before 6 a.m. Monday to Friday. So I've got a bit of a scenario on the screen to test your knowledge here and how this matters. Sarah is a part-time day worker who is scheduled to work Tuesday 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Her manager asks her to adjust her shift time on the day to 3:30 to 11:30 p.m. due to a staff shortage. And Sarah agrees to that change. She's happy to mix it up. She's got a 60-minute break in there as well. So my question to you would be, how does this affect what Sarah gets paid for that particular day? So if we have a think about it, as a day worker, because this new shift is now going after 8 p.m., all hours worked after 8 p.m. is considered overtime. So it's not going to be considered a night rate penalty because you are a day worker. Anything outside that span of 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. will be paid at overtime rates. Okay. That could also potentially impact if we've got a guarantee of ordinary hours. Overtime hours are not ordinary hours. So we need to think about that from a roster and compliance perspective as well. If Sarah was a shift worker and was working this shift, the entire length of the shift would be paid at that afternoon shift rate, so 12.5% loading. So not just from 8 p.m. onwards, but from 3:30 p.m., a whole shift. So we can see how if we've incorrectly classified someone, we're incorrectly applying loadings and overtime to each person's shift. So we need to make sure that that's correct in our systems as well. Maximum and minimum hours of engagement is where we move to next. So this is governed by the SCHADS award, something we need to be across. And what I find really interesting is that the default here of the maximum hours I can work is 8 hours. A lot of people know 10. And yes, the award allows us to increase it to 10, but it needs to be by agreement. So I'll ask you from a record keeping perspective, where does that agreement live? Where is that written? Us, we like incorporating every award by agreement clause into a contract of employment to be able to comfortably tick that box and roster someone up to 10 hours without creating a headache for ourselves. For our minimum hours of engagement, generally speaking, we're looking at 2 hours. However, if you are a SACS employee and you're not performing disability services work, we're actually looking at 3 hours minimum engagement. So even if we have a team member that's potentially providing 1 hour of supports to a client, the award dictates that they get paid for a minimum of 2. So we want to be looking at things like this when auditing our rosters to make sure that we don't have any inefficient wage costs there and making sure someone is being paid their entitlements so that we reduce that risk of unpayment. Now I've got an interesting and quite common scenario on the screen here that we see pop up. We have John, who's a part-time disability support worker. He's scheduled to work a nice 3-hour shift from 10 till 1. However, at 11 a.m., he receives an urgent call from a neighbour informing him that there appears to be flooding in his house. Concerned about the situation, John calls his team leader and receives approval to leave work early after just 1 hour of his shift. How on earth are we meant to pay this? What does that look like? What I'm comfortable with here is that as an employer, we've met the minimum engagement requirements under the award because John was rostered for a 3-hour shift. So that's not an issue. We've met minimum engagement. However, what that should look like as the roster flows through to payroll is making sure that that last 2 hours is accounted for with a particular type of leave. depending on the circumstances, whether that be approved personal/carers leave, annual leave, potentially unpaid leave, even if it is leave without pay or it's a casual employee, we still want to, from a record keeping perspective, be flagging that that was the original shift type. We don't want to lose that as part of our trail with covering a shift. Because at the end of the day, when we think about our record keeping obligations under the Fair Work Act, we must be able to pull out these timesheets, these rosters, these payslips for 7 years. So do we feel comfortable going back 6.5 years that we've got something that tells us John was rostered for the 3 hours originally? So really important that that's accounted for in our systems as well. This is probably my favorite, broken shifts, Emma, if I'm to nerd out on any particular one and pick a favorite. Broken shifts and meal breaks. Now, generally speaking, we're all pretty well across and well versed with clause 27 of the award that tells us about how a worker is entitled to breaks. So working in excess of 5 hours, we're entitled to an unpaid meal break of 30 to 60 minutes. However, if we need to work during that break and beyond, we're potentially looking at overtime rates here. What I do like in this clause, though, is there's at least some common sense when it comes to the industry that allows us for when an employee is potentially having a meal with the client as part of their normal work routine, we can simply pay that at ordinary rate and count that as time worked. So we see that in systems often dictated as meal had with client. If that's what a meal break is, what is a broken shift? It's not defined, unfortunately, in the award. So it can be quite difficult to determine, and we'll look at that shortly. One other thing I see when it comes to working out with meal breaks, whether or not it's to be considered a break that's paid with the client or if it's an unpaid meal break. I like to look at that period of time to go, is that mine? So can I leave the site? Can I maybe do a cheeky Macca's run through the drive-through, post my ASOS return, go check out the surf, whatever it might be? Or do I still need to stay on site with the client? You know, even if they are simply resting or potentially having some downtime. If that time is my own, I'm comfortable with that being unpaid break. However, if I do need to stay on site and I'm potentially there, even if the client isn't in the same room, we should still look at that as the paid through the break period. I would recommend with that making sure those expectations are clear, and the best way to do that is through having a breaks policy, whether that be a standalone policy or incorporated into a bigger rostering policy framework so that team members are clear on exactly what the expectations are when they're taking their breaks, so that we don't have people out in the field not understanding and potentially causing a liability for you down the track, which unfortunately we have seen before as well. So quite often we get asked the question when something is a meal break and when something is a broken shift. When we move into that realm of broken shifts, we want to be looking specifically at the clause of the award that tells us who they can apply to. So as we mentioned earlier, it can only apply to SACS-based employees if they're undertaking disability services work, and it does apply to home care employees. Outside of that, other people covered by the SCHADS award cannot use the broken shifts provision. So generally speaking, when we're looking at a broken shift, the things that we need to keep in mind is that we're paying a broken shift allowance. So that is spelt out in our allowances clause, at clause 20 of the award, and that amount will go up with the new financial year AX. So keep an eye out for those changes. We need to make sure that each part of that shift component meets the minimum shift requirements we looked at before. So that will be in a broken shift a minimum of 2 hours for each part of work. So we can break that shift up into 2 components of work. If we're breaking it up into 3, that actually can only be done by mutual agreement with the employee, and it is an increased broken shift allowance. So just be cautious of that as well. In terms of those parts, as we said, we need to be meeting the minimum engagement for each part. And we need to keep in mind as well what this span of hours is over a broken shift. So what we see, particularly, I want to say off the top of my head, subsection of this clause that tells us that a broken shift can only essentially span for 12 hours. And after 12 hours, we're paying double time. So when I say double time, that is a 200% penalty payment that's essentially calculated as double time of a permanent rate. If we're casual, we're plussing at 25% casual loading on top, and that is considered OTE, ordinary time earnings for payroll, not overtime. So making sure we've got those payment codes separated in payroll is going to be really important to ensure compliance here. So as an example, if I had a broken shift that was 6 a.m. till 9 a.m. in the morning, and then 4 p.m. till 7 p.m. In the afternoon, that last hour has ticked me over into that 200% penalty payment because I've started at 6 a.m. So anything after 6 p.m. will attract that rate. So we want to make sure that we're being strategic with how we rostered broken shifts. In terms of can we have a sleepover and a broken shift? The award is actually silent on this. Generally speaking, they don't mix. And when we think about the why, it's because when we look at this 12-hour span of hours, we can see how very quickly putting a broken shift before or after a sleepover shift is going to tick us over into this hugely inflated wage cost. Which is not going to be sustainable on your roster moving forward. So, maybe in those dire straits scenarios where we need someone to cover it, but we should never see a broken shift and a sleepover together on some kind of base or template roster in that way. Sleepovers. This is a very common shift structure that we do see. Just so we're on the same page when we're defining a sleepover, and this is covered under the SCHADS award. A sleepover is defined when an employee is required to sleep overnight at the premises where the client is located and is not 24-hour care shift or an excursion. So that's really, really particular there. So we're talking about the place where the client is usually residing and usually sleeping. What we have here is we have a sleepover allowance, which is currently $57.99. Again, will go up next week, so keep your eyes peeled for those changes. And that's just to cover the environmental factors of being away overnight. Doesn't cover any work to be performed. That doesn't cover anything else. So we need to be paying sleepover allowance. We need to be rostering a minimum of 4 hours either before or after a sleepover. So to be clear, that's not 2 hours on one side, 2 hours on the other, equaling 4 hours total. It must be 4 hours together on one side or the other. So it takes our minimum shift rules beforehand and flips it on its head and makes it very confusing for you. But this is very important and has been confirmed by the Fair Work Ombudsman as a matter of interpretation. We must have that minimum 4 hours. The other side, however, doesn't need to abide by any minimum engagement rule. It could be no hours. It could be 1 hour. It could be 2 hours. It could be 3 hours. The other side essentially doesn't have that minimum to abide by. So what I mean by that is you might have a sleepover that consists of active supports between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. for an evening routine. I'm going to have a sleepover period for 8 hours. It must be 8 hours, not 6 hours, not 7 hours, not 9 hours, 8 hours. And then I could just go home and do no work in the morning, or I could work for 1 hour in the morning. Any morning work there will be considered payable at a night shift rate because when we think about what our night shift is defined as, the sleepover is going to meet that definition. So that morning component should always still be paid at the night shift rate, and we should only be having our shift workers working on these sleepover shifts. In terms of work during a sleepover, overtime must be paid at the applicable rate, depending on the day, classification, all of those weird and wonderful things. And it must be paid for a minimum rate of 1 hour. So even if I'm just getting up once to assist with toileting for 6 minutes, I am still paying 1 hour. Now, let's take an example where I am waking up for 15 minutes 4 times throughout the night. 15 minutes still equals an hour. So I'm not being paid 4 hours for each time I wake up. It is just a minimum of 1 hour, and those 4 times are encompassed within that. However, if I'm waking up 5 times for 15 minutes throughout the night at different intervals, I'm then paid for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So everything after that 1 hour is added on top of. One thing that's really interesting with sleepovers, and that sleepover allowance, is that a sleepover allowance is payable on an excursion type of shift only on a Monday to Friday, which I just find to be wild and completely nonsensical. But it's a good pickup for anyone doing excursions to be across. And we'll touch on that shortly as well. Rest break between shifts. This is a very important rostering consideration for any of our SCHADS clients here. The default here is a 10-hour rest break between shifts. That is what is required. We do have one of these cheeky by agreement clauses that tells us that that break can be reduced by agreement to 8 hours if it's either side of a sleepover shift. So it's only those sleepover shifts where we can reduce the break between shifts. Again, that mutual agreement, where are we recording that? Where are we documenting that? Make sure that one's ticked off. What happens if the 10-hour break is not rostered? A couple of different things, and probably a very annoying answer my clients find me say is it depends on the case-by-case scenario. But essentially, if we're not rostering a 10-hour break, it's what we call a technical breach of the award. So while the employee, again, depending on the circumstances, may not receive penalty payments or monetary compensation for that, you as an employer, should you come to the attention of the regulator for whatever reason, could be audited, could be fined for non-compliance there. Fines could be anything from tens of thousands of dollars to multiple millions of dollars. It's not a nice thing, so if we can not get there, that would be great. Regular roster auditing should be able to stop us from getting there. We do also have a particular scenario where if a shift beforehand included overtime, and then we don't have a 10-hour break for our permanent employees, that will receive a monetary payment. Not for casuals, though, it will still be a technical breach. So there's a lot of weird and wonderful parts of the award and how they interpret these sorts of things to be paid that we want to make sure, A, we understand how it works, so we understand the consequences and the implications when rostering, and making sure that's clear for everyone that's touching this stuff as well. Remote work. Second favorite clause, Emma, I'm saying, in the award. So specifically, I'm talking about clause 25.10 of the SCHADS award. And this allows for what we call remote work. A lot of people might know it as on-call, but essentially when we look at the definition of remote work in accordance with that legislation, it's telling us that it's not part of a designated shift or part of our ordinary hours. It's not overtime or hours worked after a shift, and we don't need to do it in any particular location. So this does allow us some good flexibility, and I like to use this clause to cover things such as if we've got an out-of-hours call line where staff might escalate issues or clients might be able to call any urgent matters. People answering the phones, this could cover that sort of work. It could cover online self-paced learning. So if we're doing training modules in our own time, it could cover staff meetings. But what's really interesting about how this clause works, it lowers our minimum engagement, and that minimum engagement varies depending on if we're on call or not. So whether or not we're being paid an on-call allowance in accordance with clause 20 of the award. And actually what time of day we're picking up the calls will depend on the minimum engagement there that we're paying. So it's quite interesting to look at how this applies at different times of day. It can be a headache calculating for staff and calculating for payroll. I found myself before supporting clients doing an audit of on-call payments, and you're looking at thousands of lines of data in any given week, depending on the size of your service. So it's something that we want to be across a compliant but commercially appropriate way to manage this sort of function. And that's something that what we can support with as well. In terms of how we're paying that, when it comes to remote work, we take an example on the screen of a call that might be in 5 minutes at 7:30 p.m. Now, the award clauses differentiate between the length of time I'm paid for and also the rate, the dollars amount that I'm going to be paid for. So if I'm taking that call at 7:30 p.m. for 5 minutes, I'm just paid my ordinary rate of pay. I'm receiving a minimum payment of 15 minutes, and I'm going to receive the on-call allowance, assuming I haven't gone over my hours for the week. If that same call comes through at 10:30, it's still 5 minutes. I'm actually going to get paid time and a half, different rates obviously for casuals. And I'm actually going to receive a minimum payment of 30 minutes, even though it's a 5-minute call, as well as the on-call allowance. Again, assuming I haven't gone over my hours, because otherwise this is just considered overtime. So there's a lot to be said for strategically arranging that sort of service to make sure that we're not receiving unnecessary calls or inflated wage costs in this area as well. So if you're using that sort of service, I'd say reach out and let's have a chat to figure out how we can navigate that in a practical way, because it's quite a complicated clause there. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. I'm just going to touch quickly on work health and safety before I hand back to Emma, and we will commence our Q&A as well. I really hope those questions are coming through. Try and stump me, guys. I absolutely love it. So I want to have a quick focus on understanding our work health and safety obligations. Work health and safety can often feel like a bit of an afterthought for employers in getting that documentation up and getting our systems up and running. I know for myself, I struggle with life admin. It would be very easy to throw it in the too hard basket. So let's actually try and simplify it and understand what we need to do, because it is voluminous legislation. And if we can get a really simple understanding, we're going to have a bit more confidence coming away from today. So on the screen at the moment, I've essentially got the 4 segments of a continual process that's going to be required to be undertaken by what we call PCBUs, persons conducting a business or undertaking, to ensure work health and safety compliance. So the first point here is identifying hazards. You're doing it every day as common sense. You're doing it when we're onboarding new clients. You're doing it when you're training staff and inducting staff. We just need to make sure that it's systemized. When we identify those hazards, we then need to assess the risk of injury, so the likelihood and possible outcome of the hazard that we have identified. We do that through a risk assessment process. When we understand the risk, we're in a better place to then control it. And this is when we start to put into place our hierarchy of controls. Emma and I, when we studied work health and safety together, we took the acronym of every Sunday I eat a pizza. Which talks to us about how we can best mitigate and control the risks associated with those hazards. So that could be everything from eliminating it. So if we've got a piece of faulty equipment, is it something that we can very quickly remove from the workplace? It could be more things like PPE. It could be training, documentation, administration styles of supports there as well. So we're putting those in place to control the risk and likelihood of injury from the hazard we've identified. We then need to continually review those control measures to make sure they're appropriate. So when we break it down like that, there's not too much to it, right? There's obviously some simple documentation of framework we need to have, and that's easily covered off as well. In terms of what sorts of things we're going to apply that to in your industry, what I see being the main hazards identified and things you might be able to relate to, things like our manual handling risks. We do also lean into that psychosocial element. We did see those changes come through in 2023, confirming how we have an obligation to manage those psychological risks in the workplace. So that might be things like workplace violence, aggression, exposure to vicarious trauma, fatigue, burnout. I think my favorite one that just drove me a little bit bonkers, Emma, was low rewards and recognition is considered a psychological hazard. So we need to be making sure that we're covering that because that is a hazard identified, what we're then doing about that. Infection control and also animals, we do see pop up a lot in this industry. So if we're going to support a client that might have certain animals at home, we need to make sure that that workplace is going to be safe for the people entering the premises to provide supports. In terms of how we do all this, I know it sounds a bit complicated, but it can be a simple documentation setup. Exactly what that looks like is things like our work health and safety policies, having our safe operating procedures, having our work health and safety toolkits, checklists, risk assessments and registers are going to be very important. What I see is a really good understanding from NDIS providers of exactly what incident documents are required, reporting functions are required for the purposes of an NDIS audit and for the purposes of being participant-centric. That it falls short of meeting our work health and safety obligations, which is a completely different piece of legislation, right? So you might listen to this and go, yeah, cool, I've got an incident report form, I've got all of those things. We need to actually look at that with the lens of work health and safety and go, is it enough? Because a lot of those more general style of documents I've seen that we're producing to get registration, to be audited, they're not going to cut it. So we need to kind of tweak that a little bit to suit this workplace framework. All right, Emma, that's enough from me for now. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, but help me out. Tell me the so what.
Thank you, Corinne. That was absolutely fantastic. All right, the so what factor. I think when we look at compliance, it's very important to think about it, not just as a legal obligation, but it's a critical element of a good business practice. I think for many employers operating under the SCHADS award, staying across complex requirements around payroll, rostering, classification can be really difficult. And unfortunately, when we do see errors that do occur, it can lead to massive headaches around financial penalties, back payments, and reputational risk. So the most effective way to manage this is through proactive compliance measures such as regular payroll and roster audits. Audits will allow you to identify and resolve issues early before they escalate. And when you pair that with routine reviews of employment contracts, policies, and position descriptions, your business is better positioned to remain aligned with current legislation and the award obligations. Implementing practical tools like HR work health and safety checklists for tasks like pay point progression, casual conversion, onboarding and offboarding, and annual reviews ensures that critical milestones are not overlooked. And lastly, empowering your people leaders. Not all HR managers or general managers or even directors have that background in industrial relations and the SCHADS award. So making sure that your people leaders have that appropriate support so that we're achieving compliance across an organization. All right, so before we wrap up, I'd just like to take a quick moment to share how Effective HR can continue supporting businesses like yours. For those who are new to us or just need a quick refresher, Effective HR, we are a specialist HR and IR consulting supporting businesses across Australia with expertise in HR, safety, payroll compliance, and a strong focus on the SCHADS award. We work closely with employers in the sector to simplify compliance and provide practical ongoing support. Now, we offer two flexible models to support businesses. The first being HR on demand, which gives you direct access to a dedicated consultant so that you can get the advice you need when you need it. And this service is billed on a pay-per-hour basis, so it offers maximum flexibility without locking you into any kind of long-term contracts. Our second service is HR Partner, and this is designed to provide a more structured year-round solution. So it includes things like unlimited advice, fair work legal representation, contracts, policies, proactive updates to keep your business aligned with the legislation and award changes. And it's designed to help you stay very much ahead of compliance and not just making HR reactive. And with those packages, it includes options to integrate HR systems, which we love to use the Exemplo platform, and payroll systems using KeyPay. And if you haven't heard of KeyPay before, it is such a game changer, particularly when you are covered by the SCHADS award. It has this integration that's valuable in that you can build in SCHADS award rule sets, so automating complex pay calculations around penalties, allowances, and overtime. Now we're happy to open the floor for questions. I tried to answer as many questions as possible as we've gone throughout today's session. And if we don't get around to your question, or if your question requires some more specific advice, please select the QR code on the bottom right-hand side of today's PowerPoint. That will take you to our website, and on our website there is a contact page. We are absolutely delighted to offer a complimentary advice session. So if you do have some questions and you would like a one-on-one session with a HR consultant, we'd be happy to schedule that post-webinar. Now, Corinne, are you ready?
Yeah, I've been sticky beaking at the questions, and there's some amazing ones in there. So let's try and smash out as many as we can.
Sounds great. All right. So the first one that we had that I thought was a really interesting question was from Sandra. And the question was around, when considering an organization's sector under the coverage clause, do you consider associated entities or just consider the organization itself? So for example, where we have an associated entity only employs home care employees, but then has another associated entity that might provide some additional services under the SACS sector?
Oh, it's a really good question. And we see associated entities, as defined by the Corporations Act 2001, New South Wales myself, but essentially creeping into that workplace dynamic, because it comes into play, especially in that Fair Work Act, when we look at unfair dismissal and general protections and those sorts of things. What I would say to answer Sandra's question is, what I'm interested in is the organisation that's paying our employees. What are we doing? What's our key service offering there? So, what's our ABN on our payslip? What is that structure set up to do? What is the service that we're delivering there? So I think, again, depending on each corporate structure and how they're set up, we can review that on a case-by-case basis to see if it's relevant. But I think a lot of the times we're just focused on what is happening within that particular entity is where I would lean, but I would like to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Amazing. Thank you, Corinne. Now, another question we had, and it's such a grey area, and it's definitely probably not an answer you're going to be able to give specifically, but more so when you look at considerations. So when we look at the clerical and administration employees, which are very common in the sector, and we're looking specifically at that home care stream versus the clerk's award, and it makes it so challenging now that Fair Work have removed that article off the library. But what are the types of things in general that we do consider when we start to look between the clerk's award versus the home care sector?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think let's start with pointing out that effective from the start of this year, home care sector actually got split into two. So that's our disability care and aged care. And that's relevant because our disability care classification, so how we might read where a clerical person may fit, is going to come into it at Schedule E, whereas Schedule F covers aged care, which is so separate. So aged care is still within home care, within the SCHADS award, but it has separate classification definitions. What we see, and we're yet to see a lot of case law tested in that aged care area because it's so new, but the levels are so prescriptive. Like the way it reads, it's like one super unhelpful sentence that just says, this is what it is, this is the qualification you have, and it's very much focused on direct care personnel. So my advice is going to differ depending on what kind of substream within home care that we're covered under. Aged care, I think there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's really not a lot of wiggle room there. So we need to be looking at Do we go class? Is there potentially a dual substantive character in how we're running our business that means we might even jump across to SACS? Got to look at it on a case by case basis. For my colleagues that are sitting comfortably in that disability care space covered by Schedule E, I'm looking at things such as, if I think about a team leader role where they might be a support worker 2 days and then their team leader another 2 days where they might work from home or they might work from the office or they might work from an office within a particular premises or something like that, versus someone that might just work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday in head office that's totally separate. I'm kind of looking at the way in which someone's working. So what are their hours of work? Are they doing general administration work like reception and accounts, or are they doing more industry specific work? So, supporting care plan, participant inductions, rostering, payroll, things that are linked to the SCHADS award. They might be doing on-call work, where, when we think about the Clerks Award, there's no on-call provisions. We can't be paying someone outside of hours like that. So kind of looking at holistically how they're working, all those little factors. That was a really long-winded response, but hopefully I've gone through those considerations within it.
No, that was really great. Another great question around contracts, and can we have an employee be classified as both a day worker and a night shift worker in their employment contract?
Ooh, yucky. No, straight up no. Because how am I going to pay them? How am I going to pay that correctly? You're one or the other. And yes, it can evolve over time. You might have someone that starts as a support worker and they're doing that for 8 months and they're doing brilliantly. And then we give them a role in the office and that might then shift them into that day worker mode. And that's okay. It can evolve and it can shift, but we're not flip-flopping on any day of the week to try and pay the cheapest amount. That's not going to pass any kind of sniff test when it comes to the Fair Work Ombudsman.
No, nice and clear. I love it. Now, going on to a different area of the award, travel. We've had some questions pop up. Now, when we have a support worker travel between clients, do we need to pay the kilometres and the travel time or the travel shift allowance? Oh, sorry, really? The broken shift allowance, my mistake.
I knew what you meant. It's a really great question and you're ready for it. It depends. The key thing I'm wanting to know here is whether or not the visiting the two clients is within a continuous shift in kind of one block, or if it's part of a broken shift. So travel when it's part of a continuous shift. So I'm doing 9 till 11 with one client and then I'm traveling. And then whenever I start, say 11:30 till 1 p.m. with the next client, it's taking me 20 minutes to get there. That's just going to be a continuous shift. So I'm paying not only my cents per kilometre reimbursement, which should be broken down into two separate lines for payroll of an ATO taxable and non-taxable component. Talk to my colleague Renee about that. I don't know tax. But essentially, and that will go up again in end of financial year. But coming back to it, it would be paid travel time and kilometres reimbursement if it's a continuous shift. If it's a broken shift, so I'm doing 9 till 11 with client 1 and say 2 till 5 p.m. with client 2, I'm not paying for travel during that broken shift. I'm just paying the broken shift allowance. However, if in that second component of work, I'm visiting 2 clients in 2 hours, yes, I am paying between those 2 clients, both time traveled and kilometres reimbursed.
Fantastic. And on the topic of travel, when you have an employee doing a work trip under the SCHADS award, do you need to pay the meal allowance and the associated payments if the travel purpose is for a 3-hour meeting?
Oh, good question. I'm going to come back to, again, correctly defining what the shift is. So I guess the short answer is I can't tell you that right now until we know the locations and the specifics of it. Definitely something that we can cost out and advise on, but essentially when we look at the excursion clause in clause 25, it's talking about defining excursion as something where you are away from home overnight. So in that instance, yes, all of the costs associated are covered. But if what we're saying is essentially someone is required to travel further than they would usually go, and that's their work and that's their rostered shift for the day, the award itself doesn't necessarily cover that as an example. So we think about, trades-based industries, unionized industries. There's allowances for getting out of bed in the morning. There's allowances for driving to work. That doesn't exist in the SCHADS award. So while you might normally report to a location that's 10 minutes from home, and then on this particular shift, you're assigned a location where you're reporting from somewhere 30 minutes from home, the award's silent on how to handle that. I think holistically from a HR approach, though, you're going to want to look at, incentivizing someone to be able to do that, and finding a gentle balance. So, like I said, happy to answer with more information, but I think that they're the considerations we'd want to look at there.
Amazing. And one final question to wrap up today, just around remote work. So if you have an employee that works a 10-hour shift and then they work 2 hours remote work, should those 2 hours be treated as overtime, or does the daily limit refer to the total 10 hours remote work performed?
The first one. So essentially, when you look at clause 25.10, there's a lot of subsections to it, but it does point out that if you've gone over your 10 hours a day, it's just going to be paid at overtime rates. So what those overtime rates are, obviously depends on what stream type of work you're doing. It depends on if you're paying the on-call allowance and what that all looks like. But yes, essentially, if you've already done your 10 hours, it's just going to be flat overtime. If we have senior roles doing this sort of work, like service managers, ops managers, scheduling coordinators, etc., and they're being paid a salary, it's definitely worth a conversation in looking at how you can structure the salary to offset or include that sort of work that's probably necessary in the role, especially for smaller providers. But having a contract in place, potentially an IFA as well, depending on how we're trying to offset those particular award clauses for compliance, will be commercially efficient option. And also, if we've got our documents right, a compliant option as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Corinne, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We hope you found it very valuable, and we're very much looking forward to having those one-on-one HR consultation sessions. We will be running a part 2 webinar in July, which will be an advanced session, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the award. So we're even going to take a deeper dive into some of those very nuanced elements. So we look forward to seeing you all back in July.
Amazing. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you soon.